platform to introduce you to these partners and these experts. So today we'll be hearing from Peter Pyle, who, along with Yosef Kiat and Chunchom Hansasuda, is an associate editor who works on the Molts and Plumages sections of species accounts. Peter is an ornithologist and a marine biologist who currently works at the Institute for Bird Populations in Point Reyes Station, California, where he specializes in bird molt and plumage. He is a research associate at the BP Bishop Museum in Honolulu and at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, from where he joins us today. He's co-authored or authored over 250 scientific papers and 5 books, including The Identification Guide to North American Birds, both part 1 and 2, which is widely used by bird banders, museum researchers, field biologists, and birders. Peter has been working with this project since 2007, when the project was Birds of North America. In those days, he only had about 750 species to worry about. So these days, he's happily taking on a much grander challenge and hoping to show this audience why understanding molts and plumages can be both a fun and a rewarding way to understand birds more deeply. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on Peter. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Hi, everybody. It's starting out adventures in slide sharing here. So I thought I would get this 50% right. Let's see. Okay.
I also wanted to just, if you give me 1 second, Peter, I want to mention that Peter's talk, he's imparting so much information today, so there's a good chance that we'll go over the 90 minutes allotted, because Peter's offered to stay as long as we need to, within reason, to answer a lot of questions that you might have. So don't worry, the webinar will be recorded and we'll send it out to you next week.
Okay, I think I've got it. And go back to the thing. Are we all okay? So I wanted to correct something in the opening slide there, that the second edition of the part 1 is not quite available. It will be at the end of the year. We've got some printer issues and so forth. However, I believe pre-publication orders are being accepted now by Buteo Books and Avinet here in the United States. So I do have, this talk is evolved, I'd say, over 20 years, and I do have a bunch of slides from old presentations and new ones. So there's rather lack of uniformity to all the slides in this in this show, and some are old. And it struck me that it reminds me of bird molt, worn old bird with a few new feathers coming in. So perhaps that's appropriate. So I wanted to start with what is a molt? So start with the basics here. And I think it's very important to understand that a bird molt is a process which is still rather poorly understood. And it's been described as a profound disturbance of endogenous metabolism or alterations of whole body protein metabolisms. So the important thing to know here is that molt is not just a replacement of feathers, but it's an entire restoration of body parts that the bird goes through every year. However, we need to define molt also in terms of terminology. And for that purpose, we've defined molt, bird molt, basically as at least a few feathers are replaced regularly within the annual cycle through an endogenous process in at least a few individuals of a species. Okay, so a few things that are not molt are adventitious molt. That's a term. I prefer not to use molt for that. That's when a bird loses feathers accidentally during the course of a molt cycle and regrows them. It's not really part of that endogenous process. Or fright molt is another thing, where a predator may chase a bird and it releases a lot of feathers to distract the predator. That's another thing that I would not call molt, because again, it's not really molt, it's something else. Molt is really a well-defined process. So when I first started studying molt, there was lots and lots of terms and two or three different entire systems. And so it took a while to work through all of these terms and decide, what's right and what's not. And I believe that this mess of terms over the years has resulted in incomprehension of molt by a lot of ornithologists, and actually fear of molt by a lot. And for this reason, the study of avian molt lags behind that of other topics such as breeding and migration. I think it was just too complicated, and the terminology, the various terms that everybody was using, didn't help. Another reason that bird molt has lagged behind is that there's very few specimens and collections of birds and molt. And I think two reasons for this. One is that collectors preferred to collect birds in fresh plumage because primarily they were studying variation, systematic variation. And the other thing is that, and so in the August and September in the northern hemisphere here, when most birds are molting, they didn't want to go out and collect molt. They took their vacations then as well. Second reason is that birds are very retiring during a molt, so they're not out there as visible and able to be collected. So I'm a big proponent of the Humphrey and Parkes molt system. And it's a system that's based on the evolution of molts rather than what we see today in terms of location and extent and so forth. So, so a lot of this talk will be using this system of molts. I will touch upon the other system that's widely used, the life cycle molt system, a little bit later. But Humphrey and Parkes, so everyone understands, is a cycle-based terminology framed around the complete or near complete pre-basic molt found throughout all lineages of birds. So all birds have a pre-basic molt, and I would contend that it's the molt that accompanies this endogenous process of body restoration. So it can really serve as a framework to define the rest of molts. It evolved from reptiles, we're pretty sure. And again, this alterations of whole body protein metabolisms appears to occur not just in birds and reptiles, but also all vertebrates. So it's maybe a very ancestral function that's evolved in most or all vertebrates. But then how did dinosaurs molt? Because we know now that birds essentially evolved from dinosaurs. Well, we don't know a lot about dinosaurs themselves. However, we're beginning to find out how prehistoric feathered dinosaurs did molt. Here's a couple of papers by Joseph Kiat that Brooke mentioned on how feathered dinosaurs molt. And sure enough, it seems like their molting process is similar to the pre-basic molt now in most or all birds. Okay, by the way, throughout this slide, I'll be showing like this. I'll be showing papers, and most of them are available here at this website, the ones that I'm an author on, and Laura's going to paste these URLs into the chat so that you can copy them out if you'd like. So be aware of that as we go. Okay, so it's a cycle-based terminology that's framed around the complete pre-basic molt found through all lineages of birds. So all birds basically have this pre-basic molt, and this is what I'm going to call the adult cycle. Humphrey and Parkes used the word definitive, but we're not, that's got some issues. So adult is fine. It's the molt that occurs year after year in adult birds, and it's typically complete or very close to complete in all birds. So that's called the pre-basic molt. In the northern hemisphere here, it essentially occurs primarily in July to September. But it doesn't, it occurs at different times of year, of course, in the southern hemisphere and in the tropics. But it's well defined by this process, this complete process, as well as the restoration of other body parts. So there's throughout the course of evolution, some birds have evolved second molts within the molt cycle, which is defined, by the way, as the beginning of one pre-basic molt to the beginning of the next. That's how we define a molt cycle. And so in Humphrey Park's terms, this additional molt is called the pre-alternate molt. And in some cases, we know the pre-alternate molt because it results in a rather dramatic change in plumage color. But in a lot of other species, they'll have a pre-alternate molt that doesn't result in plumage change. And I'll expand upon that a little bit later. Now, the first cycle is different than the later cycles for a couple reasons. One is that the juvenile plumage is rather weak in most passerine birds. So in order to get out of the nest very quickly, juvenile feathers are grown very quickly and are of lower quality. They have lower barb densities than feathers that are molted in later. So what they do is they undergo, most birds undergo a molt of at least body feathers within the first 2 to 3 months of life. And that results in another plumage here within the first cycle. Another thing to understand is that the first cycle is about 14 months as opposed to 12 months for later cycles. So it's a little longer too. And that might be another reason why this additional molt has evolved. Okay, so I've put in questions that many of you asked earlier in little boxes, and I'll try to get to the answer to most. If I don't talk about it anyway, I'll get to it. But when is a bird no longer a juvenile? Well, I think the official term is as soon as the next molt starts into this plumage, and I'll explain what this plumage is in a bit. I think it's out of juvenile plumage and then is in a transitional plumage state at that point. So Humphrey and Parkes termed that molt out of juvenile plumage the first pre-basic molt. And unfortunately, this molt is highly variable in birds, however. And what happened is it led to some confusion of molt terms under the original Humphrey Parkes system. So the first pre-basic molt, for instance, if it was absent in a bird, this was called the first pre-basic molt, the complete molt at about a year of age, whereas if there was a little bit of a molt here, this was called the second pre-basic. So there was a lack of standardization, and it would even occur in closely related species, such as in American kestrel. It was considered the second pre-basic, whereas in Merlin, which was thought to lack this molt, it was considered the first pre-basic. So there was a problem there. and believe me, I've taught molt workshops for a long time. And it was just very difficult to understand molt terminology with that original designation of the molt as a first pre-basic. So in 2003, Steve Howell and some of us published a paper that reorganized the molts of the first cycle, and we called it the first basic problem. So what we did in that paper was we redesignated this molt as first pre-basic to the one that actually is the molt into juvenile plumage. So now we consider this molt from natal down in the nest, usually into the first plumage as the first pre-basic molt. And so what that does is that aligns that molt in at about a year of age as the second pre-basic molt in all birds. Okay, so pre-basic molt, this also results in all pre-basic molts being basically complete molts, because the molt from natal down into juvenile plumage is also a complete molt. Okay, so that meant, what do we call this molt here in the first cycle? And we came up with the term preformative molt. So now we have first pre-basic molts here, preformative molts here, second pre-basic, and so on. And in this first cycle, some birds can have a pre-alternate molt and others don't. But what it does is it really sets the framework for the terminology so that it's understandable, and it's also applicable to all birds around the world, which is a really important function of this molt terminology. So we are happy now with the new thing. And again, once we made that switch from first pre-basic to pre-formative, not only were the molt cycles very much clarified, but teaching them became very easy as well. It's a lot easier to understand molts when you just made that simple little change in terminology. And by the way, this is the last time these distinguished individuals here have been in my slide talks for 20 years. This will be the last time I'm showing them, because this is the last time I'm going to worry about Humphrey and Park's first pre-basic and pre-formative molt terms. And the reason for that is that very shortly, my second edition of this guide will come out. The first edition, which a lot of people are using now, uses the old terminology that considers that molt first pre-basic. But in the new edition, as well as in the part 2 that I've done, we're using pre-formative. So between the part 1 and the part 2 now, I've standardized the molt terminology to HP for all 750 or so birds that occur and breed in North America. So in summary, the pre-basic molt cycle appears to be basal to all birds, first evolving in reptiles or their ancestors. The pre-formative molt may also be ancestral as well, an extra ecdysis event in young reptiles to accommodate rapid body growth. Pre-alternate molts, by contrast, have evolved and disappeared many times along bird lineages, so should not be considered homologous. So I think the preformative molt, what we now call the preformative molt, is also found in almost all birds. And there's a very few primitive birds, or if they're not even primitive birds, they're more advanced birds that don't seem to have that molt. And I believe perhaps that the original preformative molt was a molt in reptiles that was extra for them as well, that evolved because body size in reptiles changes so quickly during the first year. So, it's possible that preformative molt has evolved from an extra molt in reptiles as well. Of course, I've looked into papers on molts in reptiles, and it's not really well understood what happens in the wild. There are some studies on captive reptiles, but we can't necessarily trust that captive molt in captive reptiles is going to reflect what happens in the wild. So pre-basic molt, yes, I believe it's evolved from dinosaurs. Pre-alternate molt, no. And pre-formative molt, I think so, but we'll have to continue our research on that. So now that we've cleared up molt terminology, we've been able to also clear up some molts in certain families of birds like raptors, which were thought not to have a preformative molt, but it turns out they have a very limited preformative molt of back feathers and some underpart feathers within the first year of life. And raptors and seabirds in particular, the preformative molt seems to have been suppressed. And we think the reason for that is that nestlings are fed high protein food. And so they're able to develop more durable and stronger juvenile feathers, which are able to last a year. And so they do not have as much of a preformative molt as other birds do that have to come out of the nest in weak juvenile plumage. Essentially, they do, but they do have this limited molt, and I think probably they have evolved from earlier raptors that are early ancestral birds that did have more of a preformative molt, and they've kind of lost it evolutionarily based on their life history of feeding young high protein food. Another thing that was understood once we changed the terminology was that the feathers of the egrets and herons, these plumes, are not alternate feathers or not breeding plumes in other terminologies, because they're grown along with all the other feathers in the pre-basic molt, and it just takes some time to come out and grow this long to be displayed. So most herons and egrets do not have a pre-alternate molts. They just have one molt per year, And these breeding plumes should be considered basic feathers, not alternate. Molts and ducks, we were able to really clarify as well, because the molt into this, this is an adult male mallard, by the way, on the left, and on the right as well. So they have an interesting molt into a cryptic plumage in summer in order to replace their wing feathers, and that cryptic feather helps them because they're unable to fly for 2 or 3 weeks. And turns out this molt into this plumage is partial, whereas the molt into the bright plumage of male ducks is complete. So, under HP terminology, the complete molt here is the pre-basic molt, and these bright males are in basic plumage, and then the ones in eclipse or summer plumage is actually they're in alternate plumage. And I know that it puts a wrench into the historic records, but I think this is correct, and it does show that how if you really look at the molts and ignore the plumage color, that ducks fit into this framework a lot better in this way than in the old systems, in which females actually had their post-breeding molt before they even bred. So that didn't really make sense in the older system. How long post-hatch does it take for male mergansers to get their breeding plumage? Basically 1 year. The second pre-basic molt, most ducks are in their full adult male type plumage. Most puddle ducks, scoters, and some of the sea ducks will take 2 years to get into breeding plumage. However, mergansers only take 1 year, as far as I know. So during that first year, the preformative molt, a few male-like feathers will come in, but then second pre-basic molt, they look like adults. Okay, another thing, and I'm not going to get into this now, is that I believe that this is probably the basic plumage of Jaeger's skuas, and that this winter plumage is which this is an adult here, is probably the alternate plumage. So it's the same kind of thing with ducks, where they have a partial molt of body feathers in the fall, and then a complete molt in the spring to result in that plumage. And so under Humphrey Parks, it makes sense that this is actually the basic plumage and this is the alternate plumage, even though it switches what we usually think of in terms of bright colors. And I'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so one of the important things about Humphrey Parks is that molts result in plumages. So the prejuvenile molt results in the juvenile plumage. The preformative molt results in formative plumage, pre-basic into basic, and pre-alternate into alternate. And that's important to understand as far as specifically Humphrey Parks terminology. Now, we use plumage in a lot of different ways, and that's fine too. We can say blue plumage or breeding plumage, and that works fairly well. But when we're talking about Humphrey Parks molten plumage terminology, we need to know that the plumage has a very specific term, which is a bird that follows the molt into that plumage. So the other thing to really emphasize here is that the HP system is really based on molts. You kind of ignore plumage, especially plumage color, when you're using the system, because as we've seen with ducks, the basic plumage might be bright or the alternate plumage might be bright. But basically, if we ignore plumage color altogether, you're much better off and just focus on the molts themselves. Now, certain species change their plumages pretty radically just based on feather wear. And here are a couple of well-known examples. The snow bunting molts, it's actually, these are feather fringes. These are brown feather fringes that wear off to produce this plumage in summer, but there's no molt that results in this change. Same with starlings. The white spots on the European starling wear off or break off during the course of the winter, and you get this plumage. And you can call them non-breeding and breeding plumage. That's fine. In Humphrey Park's terms, they're both basic plumage. It does get a little squishy when these two plumages change over, because it varies with individuals, and it happens sometime in the winter that these feathers slowly wear off to produce these. So I believe that Humphrey Park's term is actually more precise and accurate. It's simply that there's no molt, so it's basic plumage in both cases. So I will just briefly discuss the life cycle terminology that's really popular in Europe, and it does work reasonably well for birds in the northern hemisphere. Where it breaks down is with some of these species, especially tropical species, and birds that produce most of their molts on the wintering grounds, migratory species that leave the breeding grounds in warm plumage and molt once or twice on the winter grounds. And those molts are very difficult to define under life cycle terminology. However, under Humphrey and Park's, it all becomes pretty clear. It can clearly define how each molt occurs. So Europe and Africa versus the Americas and Australia. The debate goes on. Europeans very much prefer the life cycle terminology. In the Americans, we've used the HP terminology primarily. So that it'll be continued. I thought perhaps maybe we'll know on Sunday which of these two molt terminologies is better, but I wish it were going to be that easy. Okay, we did develop an age coding system called the WRP system that's based strictly on HP terminology, and I believe this age coding system will be clearer in the long run on a global basis for aging birds, or determining the age that they are, not only the age but the plumage, and also whether or not they're undergoing active molt. So all three of those things are covered under this system. And I don't have time. I'm not going to go into this system in depth here. But there are a couple of webinars. No tengo tiempo presentar WRP aquí, pero aquí hay un webinar que está en español, in Spanish as well as English, in which case you can go to this site and watch this in Spanish as well as English. And we do have another one here for MAPS banders on understanding the MAPS code. And Laura, hopefully will put the link to these webinars into the chat right now. By the way, also, I recently did one that's similar to the talk I'm giving now to a group of banders in Cuba, and that is also both in Spanish and English. And Ramiro Oregon at IBP is the one who's been translating it and doing it. And if you contact them, maybe we'll be able to put that one that we did on Cuba up as well. Okay, so let's move on. Molt strategies. I consider there to be four aspects to molt strategies: the timing, the location, the sequence, and the extent of molts. And timing and location are kind of co-evolved, so I'm going to treat those the same in this talk, or together. Most birds in northern temperate regions undergo the pre-basic molt following breeding, and this kind of occurs a lot in the tropics as well, and in the southern hemisphere. A lot of birds decide to wait until they're after the breeding season to undergo the pre-basic molt. They're worn out, their feathers are worn out. I think a lot of wear to feathers occurs, especially in females during the nesting season. So it's a good time to kick the kids off the territory, find a place to molt, sit back, relax, and let's not forget, restore your entire body function as well as just replacing your feathers. And if we were to translate this to human activity, I would say it's August again, where we all take vacations and go to the beach and read for 2 weeks. That would be the equivalent to a bird undergoing its pre-basic molt. A northern cardinal with gray plumage, that's a plumage anomaly. There's a lot of plumage anomalies, including leucism and pallidness and so forth. I don't tend to study that as much. It's a different genetic process and has nothing to do with molt. And then another person asked, how does food scarcity or illness such as avian influenza affect bird molting? Well, sick birds will not molt properly. They might have incomplete molts instead of complete molts, or some birds might also have damaged follicles and not replace feathers. But those birds tend not to survive very long, so we don't see a lot of that in a healthy bird that we see in the field. Okay, some birds undergo a molt migration, and especially here in North America, there's a group of birds, at least 20 species, that do this, where they breed up here in the western interior of North America, fly here to the Mexican monsoon region to molt, and then after they're done molting, they go on to their wintering grounds here. So it's basically a 3-step process, breeding, molting, and winter. So that's a strategy that occurs because in Arizona, in the Mexican monsoon region in May and June, it's very dry. And so there's not a lot of local birds breeding here. Sometime during the summer, the pressure centers switch, and that results in monsoonal moist air coming up into the region. So the vegetation in August undergoes a flush and the insects become very abundant. But remember, there's not a lot of local birds because it's been so dry and hot before that. Meanwhile, you've got up in the interior of North America, it dries out quite a bit and insect resources diminish. So these birds have figured out to fly down and take advantage of this system to molt in August and September and then fly on to the wintering grounds. So there's probably a lot of that going on, with birds in general that we haven't documented. It's a very difficult thing to document an individual bird where it molts relative to where it breeds. But we're slowly getting there. And this is important for conservation as well, because there's a lot of emphasis on conserving breeding habitats and overwintering habitats, but we need to also focus on habitats where they molt. And in fact, some of the thorn forests here in the Mexican monsoonal region are very important for molting, and yet they're being cut down at a high rate right now. So in general, we need to think about where birds molt and conserve those habitats to molt. So we did a project down there where we actually caught and looked at molt migrants. And one of the conclusions was that this molt is, as far as location and extent, is very stochastic. In other words, an individual may molt on the summering grounds of these species, or it may go all the way to the wintering grounds. It seems like most of the individuals undergo a molt migration to the monsoonal region, but it's not across the board. And it can even vary, it seems. We had a higher proportion of yearling birds, 1-year-old birds in our data set than older birds. And so it seems like a bird might be asking, should I molt migrate or not? And this might depend on if they're successful at breeding in the summer. The ones that are successful might not have time to molt, or they might choose to molt more locally. Whereas the second-year yearling birds, probably a lot of them were not as successful at molting. And once you're done with the breeding season, if it's early enough, they'll go down and molt in the monsoonal region. Okay, so another group of birds undergo molt completely on the wintering grounds. They'll fly all the way to their wintering grounds in worn breeding plumage and then molt down there. And these birds tend to have a more protracted molt over the winter. They're not as constrained by the need to migrate. as are the birds that molt on the summering ground. So they'll molt. In fact, red-eyed vireo takes pretty much all winter to complete all of its primary and secondary molt on the wintering grounds. Same with a lot of shorebirds that fly down all the way to the southern hemisphere. They'll take all winter to molt because not only do they have the time to do that, but also resources are getting better down there because it's their summer in the southern hemisphere. So they've got those extra resources to molt down there. Is it true that grebes molt for so long that they can only fly when migrating? No, grebes molt very quickly, but they are a group of species that molt all of their feathers at once, flight feathers, and so they're flightless for a little bit. So it is kind of true that they only fly when migrating, but that's not related to molt per se. Molts of these birds that migrate are commonly suspended too, and this is an area that's not well understood. But a lot of species will begin the molt on the summer grounds and then stop it for migration and then continue on the wintering grounds. And generally birds do not mix molting with migration. They'll stop it or suspend it, we say, for migration rather than continuing on. Although swallows appear to be an exception in that they do seem to continue molting their feathers even while migrating. So this is an important thing to understand as far as molt terminology goes too, that the preformative molt, for instance, in this white-winged tern, was suspended to migrate, and it'll finish up on the wintering grounds. And so the completion of this molt on the wintering ground shouldn't be considered a separate molt from that, which is the preformative molt. Where the heck do birds molt anyway? Well, I've kind of touched on this. We did a recent paper with MAPS banding data that shows that a lot of species that are supposedly molt on the breeding grounds actually move away from breeding territories to molt. And so we found, for instance, that Swainson's thrushes largely breed up here where it's blue, but a lot of them end up going down to the Mississippi Valley to molt, even though it's all considered quote unquote summer grounds before they migrate south. They do appear to move around quite a bit between their breeding territories and molt. And again, who wants to sit in your breeding territory after you've been working all year to raise the kids and get them out? You want to go someplace else, like we go on vacation, place where they might have the resources to molt, more nutrients, and also to provide cover. Because again, when birds undergo pre-basic molt, they need cover. They are quiet. They need a place where they can feed, but are basically under brush or something like that, where they're not subject to predation, because when you're molting, their flying capability is impaired, and they would be more subject to predation otherwise. So again, we need to really focus on where birds are molting in order to conserve habitats. And our next project with this data set, I think, will be to look at habitats where specific species go to molt, so that we'll know more about what those habitats and what's needed for their conservation. Okay, another big aspect to molt strategies is the sequence in which feathers are replaced. Now, almost all birds, not almost, but a large proportion of birds molt their primaries from the inside out, we say, or distally from the innermost primary P1 out to the outermost primary, which is we call either P1 or P10 or P9, depending on how many primaries they have. So this is a very common strategy. In addition, in the secondaries, a lot of birds start with the second tertial, which is S8 in primary in passerines, and go both directions from that, and then molt from the secondaries inward after that. And so where these two molt series collide can be either at S6, which is common, or sometimes can be S5. Sometimes this wave may go a little quicker And we found that even within species where within a yellow warblers, in this case, the second, the S6 could either be last or the S5 could be the last one replaced. So the last feather to be replaced when two waves come together can vary. In species, larger species that are diastotaxic, and that's a condition where they've lost their fifth secondary through evolution, and it's found in a lot of larger birds. They have another molt center at S5 that goes this way. So it's the same as in passerines, except they have an additional molt center at S5 that goes inward. And again, where these two waves come together is variable and sometimes a little bit irregular. But what it results in with a lot of big birds is that the last feathers replaced are S4, and then a feather in here like S8 or S9. And this becomes important for aging raptors and other birds that often will undergo an incomplete molt and will retain a couple juvenile feathers, either S4 or maybe S7 and S8, something like that. Okay, so other sequences have evolved throughout the lineages of birds. But once they've evolved, they seem to have evolved in every member of that line, that lineage. So, for instance, all albatrosses seem to start with P8 and go out. And then later it's sort of debated whether P7 is part of that different wave or that wave, but then they go inward from P7 and outward from P1. Hummingbirds seem to be very consistent in molting all of their feathers out to P9, but then before P9 goes, P10 goes. So there's some sort of change here where P10 goes before P9, and P9 is the last feather replaced. And so what I find fascinating is it seems to be the case in all hummingbirds. And another group that does this is herons, same molting sequence. However, I would venture to say it's evolved separately from this in hummingbirds. So these two groups of birds, for whatever reasons, have evolved a different sequence in primaries. All game birds appear to have a different sequence among secondaries, where they start at S3 and go both ways instead of S1 and going inward. And then owls are interesting in that they all start at primary somewhere in the outer regions between P3 and P7, but within each genus that seems to be consistent. For instance, Strix, and this is a great gray owl, they all seem to start at P5, and you can see in this individual P5 was replaced the year before, and then P6 was replaced that year. So owls are an example of a species that can have incomplete molts every year, as with seabirds and a few other things, and I'll touch upon that in a bit. So yeah, basically albatrosses will have different ages of primaries after. This looks like a second-year bird, perhaps, that's molted the outer three but retained the juvenile inner primaries. But after several years, they may only molt 3 or 4 primaries per year. These feathers are very long and expensive, so they might not be able to do them all in a year. And then we'll have different generations within the primary tract, as is the case with a lot of owls as well. Hummingbirds seem to, by and large, and as well as herons, by and large, go through a complete molt. However, some larger herons can retain a few secondaries after that molt as well. So that's what occurs. And by the way, these strategies have evolved to be able to replace more feathers within a given pre-basic molt. So if you have 2 feathers molting at the same time somewhere within the tract, there's less of a large gap within the wing, and the bird's better able to maintain flight, even though it's molting 2 feathers at the same time. In order to molt that same amount of feather material within that same amount of time and do it sequentially, you'll end up with a large gap in the wing, and that impairs flight a lot more. So in this paper, it was discovered genetically a few years ago that parrots and falcons are way more closely related than they thought. And so I noticed that they both tend to have a molt similar, starting in the middle of the tract and going outward and inward rather than as other birds. And sure enough, it turns out that both parrots and falcons undergo the same molt sequence, basically starting at either P5 or P6 and going both directions. P4 or P5 and going both directions, as opposed to the normal sequence. And I looked at all genera of falcons and parrots, and it's the case for all genera. So again, once an odd sequence has evolved, it seems to have been maintained evolutionarily throughout the lineage of the bird. And that implies to me that it evolved before parrots and falcons split, this odd molt sequence, and has been retained in both groups all the way through evolution. Now, there is one exception in the parrots, and that's the owl parrot or the kakapo of New Zealand, which is a very unique parrot, and it's a ground-dwelling parrot, and it molts more like other birds molt. So the question would be, did the ground parrot, which is ancestral to most other parrots, did it break away before this molt sequence evolved, or has the molt sequence reverted back to a normal sequence based on the unusual habits, ground-dwelling habits of that species? I wanted to put this in just to say that, and I think I've already mentioned it, that birds in captivity do not molt normally. They'll undergo 2 or 3 molts a year. They'll replace feathers at odd times. They'll undergo different things. And so it's not unusual for birds to have, in captivity, to not molt like birds in the wild. And that makes sense because they're potentially under different light regimes, hormonal light regimes. Their food is consistent as opposed to birds in the wild. They don't have to deal with predation. So these factors will sort of screw up the molt process, and they'll end up being different, molting in different ways. This person asked other questions about health of parrots and molt, and I don't know much about that, so you'll have to look for that answer elsewhere. When I was doing research for part 2, I was looking at limpkin specimens back at the United States National Museum, and I was kind of just absolutely confused and befuddled. I couldn't figure out what was going on with the molt of these, and finally I realized that they were molting backwards, that they actually start with P10 and go in, and then I'm not sure if this is really the case, but they may also molt the secondaries in the opposite way as well, but they definitely molt the primaries in a different direction than all other birds. And there's a few other birds that do this, notably the spotted flycatcher in Europe, that molts for some reason from P10 to P1 instead of the other way around. And then Siebert and Vanya Rauer did a study on molt in all of gruiforms, and I wasn't surprised to learn that all gruiforms, and that includes cranes and rails, also molt this same way. So again, this molt process inside out is unusual, and for some reason it evolved in an ancestral gruiform, and then it's been maintained through all lineages thereafter. Okay, what about extent? It varies a lot, is what the bottom line there. The pre-basic molt, as we've seen, can be complete or incomplete. The pre-alternate molt is usually less than complete, but it can be limited to a few feathers. It can be partial and include tertials and wing feathers, or in a few species it can be complete, undergoing a complete pre-basic molt and a complete pre-alternate molt every year. And then again, the preformative molt shows all kinds of variation within the first cycle: complete, incomplete, or partial, or absent, even as I've mentioned. So the extent of the preformative molt is very useful for being able to age birds, and we call these molt limits here. where certain feathers are formative, replaced, and others are retained as juvenile feathers. And as banders and ringers know, it's a really useful way to age birds that they capture, especially in the spring, to be able to identify yearling birds or second-year birds from adults that are older than second year. So these are variations in passerines. Some groups, like thrushes, are very consistent and molt, seem to molt between patterns B and C. Other species seem to molt, have a lot of variation within the species, everything from A to F. F, by the way, represents older bird that's undergone a complete molt. And in some cases, the preformative molt can be complete. Are there families where alulas? Alulas, I circled that word because I'm not sure if it should be alulas or alula plural and alulum singular. I still don't have the answer to that. But anyway, alulas are especially useful or not very useful in aging. They are, but you really need to have some experience. And the problem with the alula is that this outer feather, the greater alula, serves a function of sort of like an airfoil on an airplane where it's very exposed and it gets a lot of exposure and wear for that reason. And so a lot of older birds can have an alula that looks juvenile even though they're older. So that's kind of the big caveat with alulas. And one thing though is that there's three alula: the covert, the lesser alula, and the greater alula. And in many species, as in D here, you have one or two of them replaced and the other retained. And here's where it can be especially useful for aging when the outer greater alula is a retained juvenile feather and the other two have been replaced. Nuthatches tend to molt very few coverts during the preformative molt. They're more an example of A. And what I found most useful for nuthatches and other birds that don't molt any wing coverts is the contrast between replaced scapulars, which are newer, formative, with retained juvenile wing coverts. So that's kind of what you look for in nuthatches. Okay, why is understanding molt important? Well, aging by molt limit criteria, as I just explained, is very important. Here's kind of an obvious example. Many are not quite as obvious, but this black-headed grosbeak has replaced all of the greater coverts. The alula, these black feathers, are formative. The tertials are formative. Some central rectrices are formative, and then these are retained juvenile feathers. So it can be very easy to age a lot of birds through molt limits. And yes, it can be hard to age birds that don't undergo dramatic plumage change like male grosbeaks do. But once you've looked at this a lot, I think it becomes easier and good. By the way, that on the opening slide there was a pipit which had some nice molt limits. It was an American pipit, and you could see some nice molt limits in the secondary coverts and the greater coverts. So if in the recording of this that comes up again, you can study that guy. So here are here's the gold standard for understanding molt limits is Jenny and Winkler in Europe. They developed a really nice system of photographing open wings and show many examples of different molt patterns. Replace greater coverts contrasting with primary coverts is a good one, and so on. So this would be a resource I would really recommend getting if you want to understand molt limits a lot better. And then they have a very thorough introduction on molting systems in different birds and molting patterns and molt terminology, which is generally the oldest life cycle system. But I think you still can gain a lot about the actual processes of molts in passerine birds. Are there any other online feather keys? Yes. in North America, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a really cool website where you can go and look for feathers that you find and try to identify the species of the bird just based on one or two feathers. Okay, another good resource is the Slater Slater Museum site that shows open wings. So they've got a large online catalog of open wings of birds, and I find it especially useful for birds like rails that don't fly a lot. There's not a lot of photos of them with open wings, so you can really study, for instance, molt limits within the wing, how if there's molt clines within the feathers. I believe this is probably a second-year bird because of the contrast here, and possibly some retained coverts. And then also the Slater site's great because it shows underwings, and most specimens were prepared round skin, so you aren't able to really study the underwing, and it's again difficult to get photographs of the underwing of some of these species. So this is a great resource to look at the patterns and potentially molt limits within the underwing coverts of birds. And then a third resource that's useful here in North America is Piranga. Although I think they're expanding, they might want to expand more. I know they've expanded at least to Mexico and maybe beyond, but they have whole pages showing different plumages, formative. They use the WRP as well as our other system, calendar-based. And if you click on the wings, they expand and you can really study, and there's usually some text accompanying the wing to show you what's going on. An aging technique I'm really focusing on a lot now. It's kind of a new idea. It's not really a new idea, but based on the sequence of flight feather molt, you can actually see in birds that have undergone a complete molt, these clines in feathers from a more worn inner primary to a fresher outer primary. S1 usually starts molting about when P5 or 6. So often there's a contrast here between a newer S1 and an older P1. And then as you go in toward S6, you can see, and this is especially good because S6 is also protected more, you see a cline from more worn S1 to fresher S6. So in a lot of species that do not undergo molt of flight feathers during the preformative molt, the first year birds, the yearlings, will look like this with all uniformly aged primaries and secondaries, and the adults, the older birds, will show these clines, what I call molt clines, within each of the track, getting fresher and darker looking as you go in sequence, the way they molt. So that's something to start practicing more on birds in the hand, I think, especially in the spring. A lot of birds undergo incomplete preformative molt. Some of them will start the molt in typical sequence and then arrest it, and that's what we call arresting the molt, when what that means is that the molt is done for the year, and then say the outer two primaries won't get replaced again until the next second pre-basic molt occurs. So northern cardinal is an example of a species that will arrest the incomplete molt. The problem here is that some northern cardinals undergo a complete molt, and once they've done that, you can't tell them from adult birds just based on the plumage. Other birds have what we call an eccentric molt, where instead of the sequence is maintained from inner to outer, the sequence in the primaries is maintained from inner to outer, and this wave is maintained as well. So it goes from the central tertial in both directions, stopping wherever it stops. But it starts somewhere else in the middle of the tract and stops somewhere else in the tract. So you end up with a pattern with juvenile inner primaries and secondaries and replaced outer primaries and replaced inner secondaries. So this is a fairly common sequence that we see in North America among birds that inhabit dry and exposed environments. And an important thing here is that you'll notice that the primary coverts are not replaced along with the primaries during these molts. So you can still age birds. Even some of them will replace all primaries and secondaries, but you can still age them by retained primary coverts. So why is aging birds important? Well, our MAPS program and the similar programs elsewhere around the world really rely on being able to tell hatching year from after hatching year birds, and molt limits are really critical for doing that. And this website here shows how we use this data on aging to calculate productivity rates amongst all the birds, which is very important to understanding bird population dynamics. And then in this paper here, we were able to look at this in second year birds to identify second year versus older birds, or yearling versus older birds in the spring, and found out essentially that the yearling birds, because we were able to identify them, are pushed into poor quality habitats by older birds during the breeding season. And so we think this could be a measure, the proportion of yearlings to adults caught at a station could be a measure of how the quality of the habitat, because the second year birds tend to get pushed into lower quality habitats. Then, as I mentioned a couple of times, larger birds will undergo incomplete pre-basic molts, and in the very large species, this results in a process called Staffelmauser. It's a German term, or stepwise molt, where each feather, they molt in sequence, but each feather, after an incomplete molt, they'll retain, it arrests, and then the next molt starts with the next feather, as well as starting another sequence from P1. And so you can get as many as 5 or 6 waves of primaries going through in molt in older individuals. So here S1 is new, and here's what we call a set, where it goes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's a set because all of those are in order of replacement. It didn't mean that they were replaced the same year, but they are older from here to newer here. And then here's another set starting with P9 to P10. And it turns out the number of sets within the primary allows you to age birds older than 3 or 4 years. And then the same thing happens with the secondaries within the sequence of secondaries that we've determined to be S1 to S4, S5 inward, and the tertials outward. Another interesting topic of molt is suspended molts, how to define the suspended molts. And I wrote this paper in Journal of Avian Biology that proposes that the molts be based on sequence. So because the sequence seems to be the one aspect of molt strategies that's really fixed. So a bird can start an eccentric molt here, suspend it for migration, continue on the wintering grounds. It should all be considered the preformative molt, not a separate post-breeding and pre-breeding molt. And in some cases, such as summer tanager, the preformative molt can extend all the way into March or April in sequence, and then overlap a pre-alternate molt occurring at that time of year. And the way you can identify the feathers that are formative is by the sequence, and then a new sequence starts, for instance, with the middle tertial, would be considered part of the pre-alternate molt. Okay, so we've seen that timing, location, and extent are very plastic evolutionarily. They're not hardwired. And I believe all 3 of these processes are primarily controlled by hormonal processes, which are in turn controlled by light regimes and other things. And because of that, they're quite plastic within an individual, or within species within an individual. However, as we've seen, the sequence of feather replacement is very fixed. So I think it may be a neurological process. And this was proposed way back in 1966 by Wojtowicz, and I think that's probably correct, that it's a neurological process that determines that primary molt sequence. And we don't know. I mean, how does a bird know to start the next feather wave the next year from the place where the last wave left off? It's a very fertile area for future research. It's sort of fascinating that it does that. Okay, so here's something. So we've learned that inserted molt strategies, or why do birds molt in the first place? Well, it's primarily to replace feathers. Feathers are dead structures basically that wear out, so they do need to be replaced every year. And so I think that's the basis for molt, to begin with. However, some birds have developed other reasons for molt, or I shouldn't say it that way. I should actually say they've taken advantage of molts for other reasons. For instance, changing from a dull winter plumage to a bright summer plumage, and this would be for mate selection and breeding, or in this case, going from a bright basic plumage to a dull alternate plumage in order for camouflage during the wing molt. So you've got different results in plumage of partial pre-alternate molts. So there was a debate for a while that the actual change in color of male birds, in particular, is a evolution, that the evolution of the pre-alternate molt actually occurred for males to change color for breeding. However, there are a lot of birds that undergo pre-alternate molts that do not change color. So the bottom line appears to be that molt occurs to replace worn out feathers. And so we think now that molt, for instance, the American goldfinch, evolved first in a monochromatic species because it's an open country bird that inhabits kind of dry habitats and gets a lot of solar exposure. So the feathers are needed to be replaced twice per year. Same with birds that inhabit harsh environments like salt marshes. And the reason we think that that's the case is because female American goldfinches also undergo the same molt as males, but they do not change color. So it seems to be evolved that the molt evolved first to replace the wear feathers, and then the males have co-opted that molt to produce brighter feathers for breeding. So we think that that's probably the case here. And by the way, there's very few examples of molts that differ very much between males and females of any given species. Ducks and ptarmigan seem to have molts that may differ sexually, but there's very few other cases of birds where the molt differs substantially between the males and females. In these species that do develop bright plumage, it does seem like the males may have evolved a more complete molt in general than the females, but the molt itself, I'm sure, evolved similarly to replace feathers. And so I may fall asleep. At this point in my lectures, I usually throw up this quiz just to kind of wake people up as something fun. And that's to name the 2 North American bird species that can have complete pre-alternate molts. So there's only 2 out of all the species that I know of that can undergo a complete pre-alternate molt and a complete pre-basic molt. Scarlet tanager is not one of them. They retain their wing and tail feathers for the full year. So what 2 species, though, replace all of their flight feathers and their body feathers twice a year in North America? And the answer is bobolink and Franklin's gull. And these 2 species obviously did not evolve along the same lineage. So the more interesting question is why did these birds evolve 2 complete molts per year, and what's common about them? Okay, so that's the question I like to ask more of my audience. And the common theme here is that both of these are very long distance migrants. Both breed at high latitudes in the summer and then migrate to high latitudes in the southern hemisphere. And so essentially experience 2 summers per year. And there's 2 reasons why that's going to promote complete pre-alternate molts. One is that if you're going from the northern hemisphere in the summer to the southern hemisphere in the austral summer, you're experiencing a lot more solar exposure than a bird that stays put in one place, perhaps an average of 14 to 15 hours a day of solar exposure versus 12 hours a day otherwise. And I think the number one enemy of feathers is solar exposure. So for that reason, they need to replace the feathers twice per year. And this is birds, of course, that also inhabit open habitats. So these birds are both are found in open habitats and also I would argue harsh habitats, pampas grass in the winter, and here salt environments, which are probably also hard on feathers. And then the second reason is that, since they're down there in the winter experiencing another summer, food resources should be abundant enough for these species to be able to afford to molt completely twice per year. And so we've done this paper here where we've actually correlated evolutionarily a transition in the extent of the pre-alternate molt or the preformative molt as a group of birds transitions from forest to open habitat. And again, all these papers are available at that link that was provided earlier in the chat. Abrasive habitats would be the second reason. Why do some birds molt multiple times a year and others do not? So this basically explains some of those reasons. Okay, another interesting topic to me is molt plumage interactions. That's the fact that plumage color, why that's coming up. Plumage color can change over the course of a molt. And so, for instance, there appears to be an underlying hormonal process that dictates pigment deposition color, and then whether or not it exactly coincides with the molt process, which appears to be different, independent, will affect the plumage color of birds. So in this case, red crossbills that replace feathers, male red crossbills that replace feathers accidentally in January to June, they come in yellow, whereas if they're replaced accidentally, or if they're replaced in July to October, they come in red. And since this generally is when they molt, then male crossbills stay red. Whereas if they molt a little bit later or earlier, then they're supposed to, some of the feathers may come in yellow. And that's the case with this summer tanager, which would follow this same thing, where the initial primaries that came in are yellow. And then also feathers that are replaced accidentally in the spring in summer tanagers come in yellow as well. Here's a indication that some common murres molt later early and will come in with darker heads like alternate plumage. And I believe that's also based on the timing of molt. I put this question in just to say that yes, some birds do molt their remiges, their flight feathers completely, making them unable to fly, but those birds do not molt their body feathers completely. So they're not completely naked. Molten tropical birds is another area that we're gaining steam on here, especially with publications like Johnson and Wolf's book on molt in neotropical birds. Tropical birds tend to molt tend to have longer molts a little bit. They also are annual, I think, for the most part, even though they're not affected by seasonal change as much as boreal species. But I do think that their molts might reflect the dry and wet climates, perhaps of a lot of tropical regions. And another thing that we've found is that, which is interesting, is that molts can appear to be fixed within an annual cycle, but then can be suspended for breeding. In other words, in a species like the wattled hummingbird of Samoa, the molt can start, and then if breeding conditions become good, it suspends for breeding, and then once breeding is finished, it continues on with the molt afterwards. And what this might indicate is that molt is a rather more fixed process seasonally than actually breeding. And so when suddenly there's some rain and the resources become right for breeding, and the birds midway through molt, it might stop the molt and do the breeding and then resume after. And actually, raptors have an interesting thing where they can start the molt while incubating eggs, and then stop it while feeding chicks, and then resume it after the chicks have fledged. So they're essentially taking advantage of that quiet time of incubation to get going on their pre-basic molt, and then it stops for the chick feeding process where they need to fly a lot, and then it resumes as normal after the fledging of the chicks. Woodpeckers' molt is very interesting, and we're slowly getting a handle on that as well. Turns out that the second pre-basic molt is largely incomplete. The preformative molt is largely incomplete, but it includes the primaries and the rectrices, but not the secondaries or the primary coverts. So a bird with juvenile primary coverts but replaced primaries in the spring is an SY in most cases. However, now we're finding out that some birds won't replace any primary coverts during their second pre-basic molt as well. So most woodpeckers will replace a few outer primary coverts, but all of them seem to retain at least a few middle primary coverts, and sometimes will retain all of the primary coverts. And we've recently identified patterns such as F and maybe E, where you can actually identify a bird in its third or fourth cycle by the pattern of replacements of primary coverts. And this seems to indicate the primary coverts are replaced approximately opposite to the way primaries are replaced. So that's interesting in its own right. But you'll get 2 replaced feathers during the second pre-basic molt, 2 more during the third, and you'll still retain some juvenile plumage in the third cycle, so you can identify older woodpeckers. And right now I'm looking at sapsuckers, this pattern in sapsuckers, and they even show a higher percentage of birds that we're able to identify to third and fourth year. And in this study on the blackback woodpecker, it was really interesting because based on this aging, we were able to identify the strategies of blackback woodpecker, which is strictly a burn specialist. So they only breed in highly burned areas of Western North America. And the question was, how were new burns colonized by post-juvenile dispersal, or did adults move between burns as well? And it turns out that they're all colonized. A new burn will all be colonized by second-year woodpeckers, and then the old birds appear to stay in their burn for life. And this coincides with a peak bark beetle larvae regime that occurs about 3 to 5 years after the burn, and that coincides with probably the peak breeding ages of woodpeckers as they've mature. They've gained some experience to breed. Meanwhile, the burns, the bark beetle larvae kind of decline after years 3 to 5, but the adult woodpeckers stay in the habitat, and they probably continue to breed, but at a lower level. So as I put it, they ride off into the sunset together at age 7 to 9 years. So this was an example of how aging woodpeckers really helped us understand their population dynamics and dispersal patterns. Of course, molt in some species might be useful for species identification. Band-rumped storm petrel in particular has some populations, maybe species, that breed in the winter and some breed in the summer in the same place. And once they're at sea, you can't identify them, except you can infer which ones they are by where they are in their molting process. And seabirds tend to start molting right after they leave the colony after breeding, and may take most of the winter or the non-breeding period to complete the molt. And so if you've got a bird leaving in October as normal, it'll molt one way, and then a bird leaving in April, a winter breeding bird, will have a molt pattern that's essentially 6 months off. And we're looking at this now in a species, Ainley storm petrel, off of Mexico, which is indistinguishable from Leach's storm petrel, but does breed at the opposite time of year. So how is digital imagery helping us with the study of molt? Well, a lot. I put this little primer up like 12 years ago, just indicating how you can use sharp, crisp digital images to identify feather generations and therefore study molt. And in this paper, I examined images at Macaulay Library for molt. And the Macaulay Library is, in my mind, become the most important development in our study of molt recently, because you can go to any species in the world and look at and filter by time of year or juvenile, immature, and really start to understand how species molt and their molting regimes in different parts of the world. And this includes many species, like I'd say about 8,000 species, where we don't even know what the molt patterns are. So I'll get to that a little bit later when I talk about what I'm doing for Birds of the World. One thing that I want to emphasize, a lot of the images in Macaulay Library, in fact, most or all, are contributed through eBird. And it turns out that most of, for instance, in the study of hummingbirds, 76% of the male hummingbirds that were contributed to eBird were adult males looking like this. And only 23.5% of males were in this trashed, worn plumage like this. So my call out to all people who use eBirds is to don't shy away from taking photos like this bird here in really worn plumage, and especially ones that are undergoing molt, because not only will it help us understand molt strategies, but it'll also the documentation of where the bird is molting, if you've got a bird that's actually undergoing active primary molt, will allow us to know more about where birds molt and conserve their habitats. So what field marks tell you if you have an immature male U.S. hummingbird? Well, most U.S. hummingbirds stay in this plumage for at least 6 months, if not a full year, before they molt into their full male plumage. I circled immature because I don't really like that term. I'd rather people call them by more specific terms than that. Immature is actually a term that relates to breeding, and a lot of birds reach a mature plumage before they breed and are still immatures even though they're fully plumaged, whereas other birds will breed in immature plumage, which doesn't make sense either. So let's see if we can call molted plumages as we see them. And here's another thing. 79% of the hummingbird photos I looked at that were contributed by eBird were males, and only 21% were females. Come on, let's take more photos of females, because understanding their process is equally as important as males. Is there anything that the public can do to assist the research, such as reporting specific types of plumages found in our area? Yes. Take pictures of birds in all plumages. Take pictures of females. Load them to Macaulay. That's going to really help us a lot, especially with species in the tropics that aren't as well known as those species that breed in higher latitudes in both hemispheres. Someone asked, and this is blocked for me, but are we seeing effects of climate change on molting patterns? And yes, this paper by, again, Josef Kiat came out in 2019, showing how global warming is affecting molt and plumage over a 200-year span. So I recommend you go to the article here to learn more about how global warming is affecting molts and plumages. Okay, now I want to go over what I'm doing quickly for Birds of the World. I'm editing the molts and plumage appearance section, and I recently revised this section for Eurasian griffon, so I thought it'd be a good example to show, and it is up now, so you can go to the revised version of it. And been revising this section here, which is now called the plumage, molts, and structure section. And so what I do is I start the molts now with a general description of how, and Birds of the World, by the way, is going to use Humphrey Park's Howell terminology for all birds. And I think that's right, because it's going to be put it all into a consistent framework, and also is useful for birds that migrate and for birds that are found in the tropics where the other system doesn't work as well. So, but I do start out with a little paragraph here explaining the differences, especially for birds that are in Europe and elsewhere where the life cycle terminology is used more. So that'll be in there. And then within each plumage section, we're creating these galleries, and this is really fun. And what we're able to do is go to Macaulay Library and find good images of birds in each plumage. And everyone who uploads photos has signed a license agreement to allow the use of their photos in Birds of the World and other scientific papers, not commercial ones, but scientific ones. And so I'm able to go through Macaulay and find good examples of birds in each plumage. So these are juvenile Eurasian griffins, and I tend to put 3 in because they fit nicely across the page. And then when you click on each image, it comes up in larger format, and then I write a little caption explaining what we're seeing. So here's a juvenile Eurasian griffin with entirely consistent juvenile feathers. There are also some other aspects of the length of the neck plumes and color of the head that allow you to identify this as a juvenile. And then here's one undergoing the second or third pre-basic molt that's showing Staphylmauser in the wing, but it still retains its outer primaries. So that's that. And then it turns out Eurasian griffins in their 4th to 7th basic plumage are not identifiable specifically to plumage, but you can identify birds that are not quite in full adult or definitive plumage, primarily by, again, the extent of long and white feathers in the ruff and some other things. But photos like this clearly also show Staphylmauser within the wing. Now, by the 4th basic plumage, all juvenile flight feathers are usually replaced, so you're not able to really identify these specifically by as I say, a 4th cycle or 5th cycle by the retention of a couple of juvenile secondaries. And then finally, I'll show examples of birds in definitive basic plumage, showing various levels of Staphylmauser and explaining where the sets are and how the Staphylmauser is working in these older birds. So I'm really enjoying this process, and because of the system at Birds of the World, we're having to look at all kinds of species, that some of which I've never heard of. In fact, yesterday I did Mrs. Moreau's warbler. That's something that I didn't know anything about, and there's been nothing published on molts and plumages, so I was able to use Macaulay to try to figure out the molts and plumages of that African species. Okay, finally, as mentioned, it's not quite out. It will be hopefully early next year, maybe at the end of this year. But I have revised my 1997 edition of identification guide to the older edition, and I'm not going to go over how it all is improved, but there is a video recording up at this website, which we said earlier, that goes through all of the changes, the improvements, I hope, from 1997 to 2021, including the inclusion of WRP codes. I've added about 21 different species, a lot of introduced species here in North America. Tables, measurements are presented in tables. I've added exposed culmen and tarsus. I've added mass, and have created 15 new figures to show different things, emphasizing the molt lines that I was talking about earlier. So this will be out at the end of the year. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I hope you'll pick up a copy. The books will be available primarily at Buteo Books and Avinet, and they may already be taking pre orders for it. And we'll also be selling them, and there'll be more information about it at the site slatecreekpress.com. And it should be pretty easy to find through a search. So there you have it. And that's what I wanted to cover today. And so don't be afraid. Molt can be fun but to me, I think the main thing is to understand the terminology to begin with, and then it becomes real fun to be able to put the molts into an evolutionary context. So at this point, I will take any further questions.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was fascinating and deep. And people are so excited that you also included the questions that were asked beforehand in the talk. It's such a gift. So thank you for doing that. Brooke, would you like to start some of the questions that we got in the Q&A?
Sure. All right. So the first question is, how did you put the identification guide together, and where did you get the information?
Yeah, so the webinar I just mentioned kind of explains the history and the process I went through. I started when I was in my early 20s at the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, as it was then known, banding at their banding station at Palomar-in, and there was no real good information available on molt or aging or sexing of Western North American birds. So David DeSanti, who unfortunately passed away recently, had me do a little sheets for birds at Palomar-in, looking into their molts and plumages. And this was kind of before molt limits was really understood. So it was a basic thing where most of the differences in age were just based on plumage coloration. But then from that, I went to Sweden, to Falsterbo in the fall of 1982. And that was a preformative experience, I should say, and banded there for a season. And at that point met Lars Svensson. He took me around to look for white-tailed eagles in Sweden. And he, of course, had published the Identification Guide to European Passerines, which goes through what I ended up doing for European. And he said, why don't you do a North American one? And I said, okay. So I got back to the States and decided to do the equivalent of Lars's book for North America. And the first edition came out in 1987, and it only had to do with passerines, and then updated that in 97 to land birds. And then in 2008, I did a second part, which covers all of the water birds of North America. And so now with this revision of the 1997 part one, I'm happy to say that I cover all North American species, but they're and inconsistently in terms of molts and plumages. So that's going to be a good thing with this new revision.
All right. In your 1997 ID books, there are charts explaining the frequency of different molts in many of the species. I'd like some tips about understanding these bar charts with age and gender indicated.
Yeah, it's not exact. There's a pretty good introduction section on it in the introduction to both the old and the new version on how to use those charts. And the important thing is the bird banding lab has specific rules using those charts on what's acceptable to submit to schedules. You know, it's sort of basic. I put solid black bars when you should be able to identify all the ages of a bird within a month. Hashed bars when you can identify some but not all, stippled bars when you can identify only a few, and have different coding for the age and sex as well. And then, by the way, we revised almost all of those charts were revised for the new edition, and I've been in touch with the bird banding lab, and will be their verification systems will be using it to warn people when they're trying to age a bird that you really can't be aging. And now, of course, there's online immediate entry bird banding apps that are coming up that will hopefully use those bar charts to immediately warn a person when they're trying to age a bird that they shouldn't really be aging. Or if it's a stippled section, say something like, not many birds can be aged this way, are you sure? So stuff like that is probably coming up. I'm going to stop sharing, by the way. There we go.
Okay, so do feathers, especially primary and tail feathers, become more brittle and subject to breaking as they age just before being molted out?
Yeah, essentially very true. You see gulls and other birds that have such worn feathers that they're just down to the spikes. They get bleached by the sun as well, so that helps deteriorate the feathers. And it's kind of interesting. Steve Howell did a study where he took two wings of a glaucous wing gull and he put one in the closet and he put one out in the sun, and he showed how over the course of the year the sun really bleached out the one that was in the sun, but the one in the closet remained fresh. So that's kind of it was a good study on how quickly the feathers can deteriorate based on solar exposure. And the interesting thing is that the feathers in normal solar exposure basically became dysfunctional at about the time when the molt should occur. So the molts in birds seem to be timed based on two things: the durability of the feather of the previous generation, and also how much exposure that feather's getting. So the evolution of molts, the evolution of feather structure seems to be to have them last just exactly as long as when they're going to molt. And in this case, and in this regard, the alternate feathers of birds, if you look at them, like in our Setophaga warblers, the alternate coverts are very weak. And so they're lower barb density. They're not as strong as the basic or formative feathers. And that's because they're only needed for 2 or 3 months for the pre-breeding season, and then they get molted out. So there's no point in making a very strong alternate feather when you're just going to molt it out in 2 or 3 months.
So related to that, there's a question. I've read that pigmentation affects wear, melanin providing wear resistance. Is this true?
Yes, the melanin helps strengthen feathers and makes them more durable. So those birds with black feathers, outer primaries, those feathers will last longer than birds with white outer primaries. But it also relates to how much solar exposure and wear and everything else they're getting. And you'll see, I guess a good example might be the secondaries of a lot of woodpeckers are black with little white spots along the edges. And if they get too worn out, you'll see that the white in those little circles get worn away. And so you end up with a scalloped look to the outer primaries. And there's an example of how the melanin part of the feather has lasted longer than the part without any melanin at all. And some birds like snowy owls, well, there's some recent evidence that the melanin actually fades with time in snowy owls, but they'll birds with white feathers may tend to molt more often than birds with black feathers, simply because the feathers are not as durable.
Thank you. So this person says, thank you for such an informative talk. What do you think museum collections could record to better assist in molt studies?
I guess, to begin with, well, one thing is body mold is very hard to determine on photographs. And whereas with specimens, once you're skinning them, you can actually see the pin feathers growing on the inside of the skin. So I think more information on that, what percentage of body feathers are molting, could help, because otherwise it can be pretty hard to determine if body feathers are molting or not. And in some cases, there's cases of birds where we didn't think of inserted molt existed, but in specimens, it's clear that there is an inserted molt there, and it's just because it's been so hard to detect that molt on photographs, or even banded birds sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are any birds capable of maintaining non-degraded feathers through a molt to reduce their energy consumption, or will they always molt their feathers regardless of condition?
Yeah, that's a good question too. There's some evidence that if a feather gets broken or worn entirely, that it might get replaced out of sequence or adventitiously, but we don't know a lot about that right now, and I don't know what the mechanism would be, how the bird would know, how the the bird's physiology, the bird would know that feather was broken and molted out. I mean, it's part of what we need to determine more about Staphylmauser and how the bird knows to start at the primary that it left off at the year before. It's a big area of research. I hope I answered that question correctly.
Yeah, I think so. There's a related question that says, are you saying that birds can decide when to initiate or postpone molt? And I think you've just kind of answered that as well.
Yeah, and then the other thing that's interesting is that example I gave with the wattled honeyeater in Samoa, where the molt does seem to be more fixed annually, but then they decide to stop it for breeding. So there is some sort of interaction between the molt process and other life history functions throughout the cycle. Another thing would be a bird that starts to molt on the summering grounds and then decides to migrate, and so the molt stops. And so there's hormonal processes at work there that we really don't understand.
Are there any species for which the shape of primary coverts, tapered versus truncate, should not be used for aging?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the revision to the ID guide, I took out that shape of the primary coverts. And the reason is people are having a lot of trouble with it to begin with. But it turns out, I think the intrinsic juvenile primary covert is the same shape as the basic covert. It's weaker because the barb densities are less. And what happens is through the course of time, the edges of that juvenile feather wear at a greater rate than the edges of the basic feather. So by the time they're worn, the primary coverts do look thinner than the basic coverts on average, but it's not an intrinsic difference. It's a difference that's based on time and wear and species and all kinds of other things. So because people were having trouble with it based on the 1997 edition, I took that out. And by the way, I got comments from, I think, 1,200 or many thousands of users to 97, which I've tried to incorporate as much as possible into the revision.
Related, there's a question, is there anything to learn from molting tail feathers?
Sequence is not really well known. Some birds molt inside out, others molt. Generally, they molt with the central pair first and then out, but then sometimes the sequence can vary. So I think there's more work to be done there. Woodpeckers have an interesting molt where they start not with the central pair, but the next pair and go out. And then the central pair is molted last. And we think that's because that central pair is really important for their habit of moving up trees. And so that it's better for the bird if that central pair gets replaced last when all the other feathers are fresher to maintain its ability to move up and down trees.
All right. Is nutrition prior to molt more important in red, orange, and yellow birds?
Yeah, that's another good question. How carotenids interact with molt, and those examples of crossbill and summer tanager are there. There's a paper we have in press with Santi Guiar right now, looking at molt in 5 species of warblers, and the molt of the migratory species, the molt it shows an opposite pattern. Usually molts in tropical species are more extensive than in migratory species because of food resources and the constraints of migration and so on. But in this genus, Cargillina. It includes Wilson's warbler, red-faced warbler, Canada warbler, pink-headed warbler, and red warbler. The two tropical species there have a less molt than the migratory species, and we proposed that it may be related to the fact that red feathers might be more hard to produce than feathers of other color. But that whole red thing interacts too with the availability of carotenids during the process. So there's a lot to learn here.
All right, someone asked, do juvenile sandpipers born in the Arctic use these low-quality feathers to fly from the Arctic to South America? Somehow I would have thought that they would be higher quality based on the length of flight.
Yeah, they are higher quality. That's the answer there. Except for, what's interesting is a couple shorebirds like Dunlin don't do that. They molt up on the breeding grounds before they fly, but they only molt body plumage. So again, the plumage of shorebirds breeding in the Arctic is going to come in stronger, I think, because the chicks are being fed high quality, protein-rich food, so they can develop stronger feathers, and that it allows them to be able to migrate all the way to the winter grounds as far as the tip of the southern continents, to then either replace their feathers or maybe not. So a lot of shorebirds keep their juvenile feathers, or at least some of their feathers, throughout the year. So I think that's basically how that works, as opposed to a songbird that has to get out of the nest really quickly, develops really weak feathers, and then has to replace them more quickly.
All right. How much weight will birds lose during molting?
There's quite a few papers about that on ducks, because they undergo complete molts in secluded areas. And I don't know, I think probably they don't eat much when they're molting. It might even be a thing where they don't want to eat a lot when they're going through this restorative process, or they might start getting nauseous. But whatever it is, they do lose weight while they molt, and I think their general strategy is to fatten up quite a bit before they go into molt, and then be able to coast on their fat while they replace their feathers.
All right. What is the difference between a feather cline and a pseudolimit? Are they the same?
No. Okay, so a feather cline is where the feathers actually were replaced in sequence. So each feather is progressively a little newer than the one before it, and in some species like red-eyed vireo that take 6 months to molt all primaries, the cline becomes more evident. A pseudolimit is all feathers of the same generation, so there's no difference in timing necessarily there, but there's more melanin in certain feathers, and this tends to occur with the more worn feathers, which are also, or the more exposed feathers, which are also the feathers that you use for molt limits. So tertials and intergrator coverts often have more melanin in them naturally than the other feathers of the wings, to protect them more from the sun. And then what it does is it also makes it look like they're replaced versus not replaced when that's not the case. And so that's why we call it a pseudo molt limit. It looks like a molt limit when it's not. So those are things to be very careful. Many of our American sparrows have that condition, and it really is hard. It becomes really hard to know if they've been replaced or not. And then especially in species that can also replace them during pre-alternate molts. Black and white warbler is another example of a bird that's can be really difficult to age by molt limits right in that area.
Related to red-eyed vireos, which you were talking about earlier, red-eyed vireos are described as molting on wintering grounds. What explains catching them on breeding grounds in summer while they're actively molting?
Yeah,
molt on the winter grounds?
Yeah, that's what I said as well, is that it's stochastic, remember, where birds molt is pretty flexible plastic. In that molt, the paper we did showing evidence for movement, we did find red-eyed vireos on the summer grounds in Molt at map stations in August. So a few of them maybe molt, do a molt migration like other birds. I doubt that they actually molt right on the breeding territory, but they'll move around, molt a few feathers. I think they probably by and large suspend the molt like a lot of other birds do. They'll start it, stop it, migrate, and continue on the winter grounds. Seems to me from looking at, I'd say I'd probably looked at 500 red-eyed vireos, that most of them molt on the wintering grounds. They fly in worn plumage, commence the molt in November, go through it slowly through March, finish in March, and then fly back up after a complete molt on the wintering grounds.
Gull people are always talking about first cycle, second cycle, etc. What does this mean?
Old people? Is that what
gull
you said?
People.
Gull people.
Gull people.
Yeah, well, that's old people. So cycle-based, it's the Humphrey Parks terminology, although it's in gulls, it seems to be more used than in other groups of birds. And basically, the cycle, as I've defined it, is from the beginning of one pre-basic molt till the beginning of the next. So a first cycle gull will actually be the beginning of the first pre-basic nest, which is the same as the pre-juvenile nest in the breeding ground, through the initiation of the second pre-basic molt. So that's a first cycle gull. Then second pre-basic to third pre-basic is the second cycle. Third pre-basic to fourth is the third cycle. And in gulls, you can actually tell these ages apart by plumage, which is why it's probably more used in gulls. In most passerines, you can identify first cycle birds from second, but beyond that, second becomes equivalent to later. So it's not as, the cycle-based system just simply isn't used as much as it is in gulls. And I think that's the main reason.
Okay, there's a couple questions about resources. So first, is there a resource that lists the extent of molt and associated feather tracks per family? And
yeah, okay.
You can go ahead while I find
you. Not really, but it's something we're working on. I'd be most interested in looking at sequences in birds by family and trying to match that up with systematics to see exactly when birds developed, when sequences developed within a lineage of birds and how far they've been maintained. So that's one area that I'd like to pursue. I think there's a lot of variation, and this is because of the plastic nature of extent and location. I think the question was on extent, that it's all over the place. You'll get birds in the same family that have a partial preformative mold, an incomplete or a complete. And you just have a lot of variation there. And so I think the mold extent, as I've been saying, it matches up with the life history of the birds more. And that life history is species specific. So it's going to change with species. And so extents are going to change with whether a bird migrates or not, how far it migrates, what its habitat is, how much solar exposure, etc.
Mm-hmm. So the second question is asking for a resource on genetics behind molting and color morphs, particularly for birds of prey.
Yeah, that's not an area I'm too familiar with. Color morphs is really interesting. It's plumage can be completely different, but it's not related to molt. And a paper came out recently on Swainson socks showing that the morph is preserved through the life of a bird, so it doesn't change from year to year. Whereas molt plumage is based on molts can change from year to year, so that's kind of a difference there. But as far as the genetics of molt, I think there's some work with that in snow geese and some other species that maybe can be researched.
Oh, Laura, I think you're muted.
So what do you think, Brooke? We've got a few more questions left, but we really should kind of wrap it up. I so appreciate your time and your expertise. This has been wonderful. And judging by all the comments, people have really loved it and appreciated it. So I loved your message. The message is take a lot of photos, take photos of both the brilliant males and the drab females, and take photos of all sexes and age classes, right?
Yeah, and birds in molt, trashed birds in molt are going to be really instructive for our study of molt, and also enable to know where these birds are molting to be able to understand what their habitats are and conserve them.
Great. Well, thank you, Brooke, for helping co-host today and for fielding the questions. The recording will be sent within a week. We have, well, probably only a few days. If possible, we'll include the chat stream, and I'll include links to all of Peter's links to his resources inside the email. So thank you all for coming, and we'll let you know when we've got the next webinar scheduled. Have a great day.
Thank you guys all for attending. I obviously enjoy doing these things as well. So
I'll be back.
And thank you guys for setting it up.
Absolutely. Take care all. Bye-bye.